My name is Jong-woo Han. I am the president of World History Digital Education Foundation, which covers about the Korean history, culture, society, economy, and geography, overall about Korea other than the Korean War. We are doing this to preserve your memories since the Peace Corps volunteer program was in 1960s and ended in 1980s. But at the same time, we want to honor your service and your experience. So that's why we are doing this. And thank you for receiving us. And it's my great pleasure and to meet you. Thank you.
Pleasure is mine.
What is your name?
Gay Garland Reed. The first name is Gay, G-A-Y. My family name before I married was Garland, G-A-R-L-A-N-D, and then Reed, R-E-E-D, was the name that I took from my husband.
And by any chance, do you have a Korean name?
I do. My Korean name is Kye Ka-yeon.
So Kye is last name.
Last name, family name.
And Ka-yeon is your first name.
Is my personal name, yes.
How did you get that?
A student gave it to me, a student in Korea. Well, I think this name based on the sound was given to me, but the Chinese characters were given to me by a Korean student.
Aha. So can you talk about what Chinese character for each?
Yes. In Korean language, Kye is a kind of tree in the moon, and it's a kind of has a romantic connotation. Kye-sunamu.
That's right.
It's the tree in the moon. Yes. The ka in Korean means elegant or beautiful, and yun means swallow, the bird. Jebi. The Korean.
Jebi, yes.
Yes.
Perfect name for you.
Well, thank you. I feel blessed to have it.
May I ask your birthday?
Yes, January 10th, 1947. So I'm 75 this year.
You look terrific. My goodness, 75?
Yes, you're very kind.
Wow. And where were you born?
I was born in Oceanside, California, which is northern San Diego County.
And could you tell us about your family background, your siblings and your parents when you were growing up?
Yes. I have one brother who's younger than I am. My dad was the publisher of the local weekly newspaper.
What is that?
It was the Carlsbad Journal, and which no longer exists. A lot of small newspapers got swallowed up by big media agencies, but
Yeah. And could you tell me about your educational background, including the high school name and when you graduated?
Okay, I graduated from Carlsbad High School in 1964.
1964. And
after that, I went right to college.
What
I
college?
went to a place called Cal Western University, which is now United States International University. It was located in San Diego.
San Diego. And what did you study?
English literature. I started in drama, English literature.
And when did you graduate?
1968.
1968. Did you learn anything about Korea in your Carlsbad High School or in your university?
Well, in university I did, because one year, must have been at the end of my sophomore year, I saw a flyer for a program that was going to be a quarter in Asia. You know, we'd take like a semester abroad kind of thing, but it was a quarter in Asia. And my inclination has always been toward Asia. My mindset, my heart is always toward Asia.
Why?
It's just in my blood, I think. Partly because of my parents, because we had people visit us from other countries. My dad was in Rotary, and we had students from all over the world, international students come and
You mean Rotary Club?
yes,
Ah.
come and stay with us and visit us. And so I just somehow had an affinity for Asia. So when I told my parents about it, they were able to let me do this kind of semester or quarter abroad. And we started in Japan, and the professor who was with our group was Korean.
Really?
Yes, his
Do
name.
you remember his name?
Yes, Kim Young-hum. Kim Young-hum was a professor. I think it was history, political science, like that. He wrote a book in 1966, I think, that was called Turbulent Century or something like that, about Asia. So he accompanied us along with another professor, a woman professor, who was an ethnomusicologist. We didn't go to Korea, however. Mm-hmm. We went to Japan. We spent 6 weeks in Japan, and then we traveled to Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, Borneo. I mean, a lot of places in Southeast Asia. But the initial part of the time was mostly in Japan. Mm-hmm. So I knew about Korea through Dr. Kim. Mm. He was fun and funny and just a lovely person to be, and smart. And so I knew about Korea.
Yeah. So, but you didn't learn anything about Korea from your high school?
No.
No.
My family had a friend who was a Marine who had served during the Korean War. Mm. So we knew, the Korean War was something I'd heard about, but mm-hmm. I didn't know much about.
Could you tell me a little bit of your perspective about the American society in late 1960s and 70s? What was going on there?
Well, in the 70s, I was in Korea the whole time, but in the 60s, there was, of course, students were demonstrating against the war. There was a lot of protest music. There were student gatherings, and that kind of thing. I spent most of my time in the theater because I was working behind stage, doing a lot of drama and stuff. So I was practically in the theater from morning to night. I didn't do too many protests, but mm-hmm. I was out there for a couple.
Yeah. And what brought you to Korea? How did you decide to join the Peace Corps program?
Well, as I got near the end of my university time, I applied for graduate school, and I also applied for the Peace Corps. I got because I just felt like I'd been in school so much, but by the end of my undergraduate, I got the feeling that maybe going on to grad school, even though I was accepted, I decided I wanted to do something. I didn't want to sit and study anymore. So into the Peace Corps, I said, yeah, let's go, And so I chose to go into the Peace Corps. Mm-hmm.
So what were you trying to study in your graduate program if you continue on that academic career?
I would have studied English literature.
Again?
Mm-hmm. But when I actually did go to grad school about 20 years later, mm-hmm. I studied something else. So
we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But when was it? Do you remember that you decided to join the Peace Corps program, and why, more specifically? You wanted to do something in action rather than just doing
exactly.
in theory.
Exactly.
What motivates you specifically?
Well, I think that it was an idealistic period for young people. We were really interested in I guess as young people, you always want to be part of saving the world, Mm-hmm. And I think that was true of me as well. And I was inspired by John Kennedy's "Ask not what you can do for yourself, ask what you can do for your country." Yes. And so Kennedy was very inspiring, and I think that was part of the impetus.
So when was it? Do you remember the month or date that you joined the Peace Corps volunteer program?
I was, it would have been in 1968, just shortly after I graduated.
And where did you get any training before you was assigned to any country?
No, they assign you to a country and then they give you training. I was assigned to teach, I had asked to teach, my choices were Nepal, Malaysia, and Thailand. And they put me in a training program for Libya. And so I spent about a month and a half in the Libya training program. And as I told you before, my inclination was always toward Asia. And I just felt like I didn't fit in that Libya training program. I didn't, it was just not a good fit for me. We were supposed to be guinea pigs, the first women who had ever been volunteers in Libya. And Libya was in a time of upheaval pretty much at that time. King Idris was still the king there. It was before Gaddafi. But so after about a month and a half in the training program, I said, you know, I'm just really uncomfortable with this. And so I went and talked with people there. And they called Peace Corps and they said, we have several programs available. You can go to Afghanistan and give smallpox vaccinations, or we have an English teaching program in Korea. And I said, that's it. That I would love to go to Korea and teach English. And so they sent me home, and then about a month or 2 months later, I was in a program for Korea.
Did you get any specific training about Korea history, culture, or how did it happen?
All of that.
All of that?
All of that. We had people who came in and talked about Korean culture. We had professors from the University of Hawaii. One I remember later became a colleague and a friend, Hugh Kong, who was a history professor at the University of Hawaii. And he came and taught us about Korean history. Honestly, that part kind of just was not as interesting to me. I was more interested in the culture and things about, you know, the ways of life and things like that. But we also had language training. And I would say I didn't learn so much in the language training as I did when I got to Korea. That was, you know, on the streets. Learning language is where you need to learn language.
But wasn't sort of a financial aspect of the Peace Corps volunteer program of concern to you? I mean, they didn't guarantee $1 million for your job, right? And you knew about the whole other benefits that you're supposed to have with the Peace Corps volunteer program, which didn't do much, right?
That's correct.
Why? I mean, wasn't that your concern at all?
No.
Not at all.
I didn't think about it. I didn't think about it. They actually, if you look at my Social Security sheet, I ended up being in the Peace Corps for 5 years. The commitment is 2 years. I ended up for 5 years. So for 5 years, I have $900, $900, $900, $900. That was called a readjustment allowance. That was not a salary. The living allowance we got when we were in country was paid to us on a monthly basis. All our health care was taken care of through Peace Corps. So we really didn't want for much. The school where I taught, which was Sogang University, provided the housing for us. And then we were given this stipend for food and other incidentals. And it was plenty.
So when did you leave for Korea and how?
I left for Korea. Now this is something. I was trained in Hawaii on the Big Island. They had a program in Hilo, Hawaii, and then we went into Honolulu and did some practice teaching. But so this is January. We're in Hawaii, and I'm a Southern California girl. I've never seen snowfall. It was, and so going from Hawaii training to Seoul in January.
Of 1969.
Of 1969. And it was the coldest I'd ever been in my life.
Yeah, I told you there are so much parallel between Korean War veterans' experience and...
Yes. So generally speaking, most places in Korea didn't have any central heating at that time. So it was cold.
Cold, especially from California to Hawaii and then Seoul.
Exactly.
Did you get there by flight?
Yes. We flew from Hawaii to Seoul.
Seoul, and you landed in Gimpo.
At Gimpo Airport. Yep.
Now, be honest. When you first landed in Korea, how Korea looked to you? What is the first image and what did you think about it?
Okay, I had traveled in Asia before, so maybe my reactions were not, although I hadn't been to Korea, maybe my reactions were different from a lot of other people. The only thing I really remember is that it was cold. That was the thing that was the most astounding thing for me. And then, of course, you realize immediately that you are a foreigner, a stranger. And so suddenly you become kind of a star, or like everybody wants to be near you and to try and practice English with you, and 미국 사람, American, the kids were always following us, and I don't remember feeling appalled. There was poverty, and occasionally, when I first got there, it was the first time I'd ever seen beggars, or maybe I had seen some beggars in other countries in Asia, but it was there were quite a few people who were in need of money.
Yeah. And that's 1969.
Yes.
Yep. And in 1962, the Park administration implemented first 5-year economic development plan, but still very poor, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So when you landed in Gimpo, and then what happened to you?
Then we were taken to a yogwan, a yogwan.
Can you describe yogwan to young students here in the United States?
Okay, a yogwan is kind of like a hotel, but it's a hotel that doesn't have any beds because you sleep on the floor with a yo on the bottom and an ibol, a kind of a quilt on top. And when Peace Corps volunteers get together, they tell bathroom stories.
Wow.
And we had bathrooms, but the toilets were in the ground, and so we learned how to squat and use the toilet.
Must have been hard for you because you never done.
Never done that before. I had in Japan, but that wasn't something that we grew up with. So it's a wonderful exercise, getting up and getting down. And it's something that I should be doing more of to strengthen my legs. But so that was different. So a yogwan was kind of a hotel. And the heating was not in the room. The heating was on the floor. It was an ondo floor. So the heat came up through the floor. And as long as you were sitting on the floor with the ibol or some covering on top of you, you were very, very warm.
Hot, even hot.
Hot, yes. I have a poem that I've written about that, so I'll share the poem with you.
But you can have an icicle here.
Yes.
Air, right?
Right.
It's not air heating, it's a floor heating.
Exactly.
Right. So what did you think about it? First, was it kind of culture shock to you?
I take everything as it comes. And that part, I think it's partly what Peace Corps teaches you. Whatever is, and that's the natural state of affairs when you're there. I was not shocked by it. I think, frankly, if you talk about culture shock, I really had culture shock when I came home because the U.S. seemed like a very strange place after living in Korea.
Oh.
Well, so I ended up staying in Korea, as I told you, for 5 years.
Yeah.
Things that surprised me when I got home were the Sunday newspaper, all the advertisements and the thick newspapers. In Korea, the newspaper covered the whole world on about 4 pages, in those days. 4, pages. You could get news from anywhere in the world. But I came home and there was this huge newspaper that didn't have any news. It was just advertised.
So too much commercialization.
Too much commercialization, yeah. That plus the absence of interest in us when we got home. Nobody was interested in us anymore. In Korea, people were interested in us, and they were curious.
You're a star, they are.
They were curious about us, and they wanted to know stuff. And when we got home, we were ordinary.
Yeah. How was food? You didn't have much Korean food in the state before you left for Korea.
That's
and
true.
And you went into Yeogwang, which is like a motel, very low grade of motel, with a very different system. How was Korean food to you first?
The first time I ever tasted kimchi was actually in Hawaii because I stayed with a family and the mother was part Korean. So I tasted kimchi in Hawaii. Kimchi is an acquired taste, but once you acquire it and you have it regularly, it becomes something that you crave later on.
Like an addiction, right?
Kind of.
You have to have it.
Yes.
I'm missing it already.
So the food was very different, and so of course getting used to new food, new things. There were some Korean things that I never developed a taste for.
Such as?
Sea cucumber, mostly exotic things. But most Korean food, when I had it, all the vegetables I really liked. I liked the way they were seasoned, and it was spicy, but it became part of the normal life.
Did you know that you are going to work in Sogang University before you left for Korea?
They assigned us just before we left, and because I had some background in theater, they were looking for somebody at Sogang University who, they liked the fact that I had done a lot of theater because they were famous for their English plays.
Could you just briefly talking about Sogang University? I know for sure we were in Yonsei University, very close to each other, but for the audience, what is Sogang University?
Sogang University was a school that was started by the Jesuits, and it was started in 1960, I believe. So, in fact, I can tell you exactly. I was there for the 10th anniversary of Sogang. It was a new school, but it was beginning to get a kind of a good reputation. One of the things that they did that students in Korea liked was that they taught a lot of English. And so students who wanted to learn good English very often, went to Sogang. It was attractive because of that.
One of the top private universities located in Seoul. So.
Nowadays. In that day, not so much, but now, yes.
So you already knew that you're going to teach English there. And what was your classroom experience with college students of Koreans?
Okay. So, well, I found many students were eager to learn. Some of them weren't. But in general, I would say that Korean students were pretty eager to learn English, and I taught a variety of different classes. Solong also had a department called Mass Communications, and so they created a program where they taught English partly using TVs. So we used to have dialogues that were done on TV where we acted in the dialogues, and then we showed these dialogues to the students and helped the students learn to memorize English. And so the television was used as a tool for teaching conversational English.
I remember I practiced AFKN 청취는 이렇게 한다.
Oh, really?
So there was a tape of, for example, weather forecast, and I was listening to the tape, and then there is already transcribed text, but there was a parenthesis open in many places, so that I had to fill in while listening to it.
Oh,
It was
good.
very helpful, actually.
Good.
Yeah.
I also did a TV program with KBS, and it was called Let's Speak English. And it was a very short time, maybe a few months I did it, but we did some programs for that. But that was outside of Sogang. But yeah.
Also, you mentioned about the drama, right? So you did
Yes.
something with Sogang University.
Yes, Sogang did a lot of musical dramas, and one year in 1972 we did West Side Story, and which has now become really popular again. But and so people know about it. But in those days, it was a show that I was familiar with. The movie had come out, and people were interested in the film at that time. So we did this show, and it was quite an event. I did some of the choreography for it, as well as directing the performance. And we had an orchestra that came and played the music, which was very hard music to play, with Leonard Bernstein. So it's very sophisticated music. And I remember the orchestra being surprised when they saw the music. But we had a great fun. It was done in English, so the students did the show in English, and I don't know how Korean audiences could figure it out. But to be honest, it was quite well received. It was really, really lovely. The reception. It was quite a success. Because Sogang was known for its musical drama. They had done Oliver, and then later on we did The Fantastics. We did a variety of musical theater. Man of La Mancha we did later on. Yeah.
So West Side Story was the kind of first cases in Korea, not just in Sogang University, to put it onto drama there.
Actually, there were other ones. Oliver was...
No, I'm talking about West Side Story itself.
Oh, it was the first time that West Side Story had ever been done in Korea. Yes, for sure.
So you made history.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
My claim to fame.
So where did you sleep? I mean, where did you live?
Where did we live? Okay. Most volunteers stayed with families, and I kind of regret that I didn't have that experience. But Sogang University had a place called the Waegugin Sukso.
Yeah.
It was like a boarding house for the foreign teachers who taught at Sogang, some of whom were missionary types who came with sort of Catholic missionaries, lay missionaries, not priests or nuns. And so I stayed in that house with other volunteers.
Was it within the campus?
It is in the campus, yes.
Wow. So you didn't have as much as exposure that other Peace Corps volunteers who did live with the families of Korea.
Exactly. I mean, we had two ladies, one lady living with us who was Ajumuni, who cooked for us. And so we interacted with her. She didn't speak any English. And then we always interacted with Koreans outside in the streets, you know. And probably because I was in that situation, my Korean was not as fluent as other people who lived with Korean families. No doubt.
선생님 한국말 잘하시죠?
아이, 조금만 하시죠.
That's not 조금, you know.
아, 조금밖에 몰라요.
That's pretty good. Can you read books in Korean?
I can read, because the alphabet is so revolutionary and so intelligent. You know, it's such an amazing alphabet. I can read anything, but I don't know what it means necessarily. So learning the alphabet is really relatively easy. And so you can read it, but you don't know necessarily what it means. So I don't read books in Korean.
How was your life in Korea in the first 2 years when you began to teach in Sogang University? How often do you go out of the campus? Did you have many friends? Did you travel around? Could you tell me about your life in Korea?
All of that. I did have Korean friends. We went to tabangs. Tabang is another cultural anachronism that belongs in the past. Nobody in Korea knows what a tabang is anymore. It's a tea room, and we used to go together with student friends, mostly Korean friends, and go to the tea house and sit and drink coffee. It was coffee. It was not what we recognized as coffee in those days. Now it's very delicious, but it was cooked coffee. and we drank coffee, and we would sit there for hours in the free time and just talk and listen to music. And it was a lovely experience. Do you remember the Wangja Tabang?
Wangja Dabang, yes.
Yes.
How about Doksuri Dabang?
No, the Wangja Tabang was my favorite.
Uh-huh.
So that's where I always went and hung out with people. Now, one thing that I can tell you is getting to the tabang, we had to slog through the mud because it was there were no paved sidewalks or streets at that time. So we always went through the mud. And my students always came in gomoshin, you know, rubber shoes, which were very wise. It was very wise foot attire because you could just wash it off, and it it was easy to clean. Yeah, so the streets became seas of mud in those days when there were no paved.
And those days they listen a lot of classical music too, right? You remember?
I do remember, and what I remember is that most of the Korean students knew way more about Western classical music than we did. It was, and they were very well schooled in the different composers and all of that.
You continued to teach at Sogang University
For 5 years.
for 5 years, so that means that you extended your service.
Exactly.
Right? Why? Why did you do that?
You want to know the secret?
Yes.
I had a Korean boyfriend.
Oh boy.
So that's probably the main reason. But I also loved my job. I loved teaching. I loved I just fell in love with Korea and the country and the people and everything. And I was comfortable and I wanted to stay.
You're kind of lucky because you got almost like a professor job in Sogang University, introducing all these literatures and drama, while many of your colleagues went to very countryside of it.
Absolutely true.
Yeah.
And they gave me a lot of freedom to teach what I wanted to teach. So I taught classes in literature which had been my undergraduate degree. So I could teach some of the English majors, especially about Western poetry and mostly poetry. And so that was fun for me and fun for them, I think.
Actual profession was a professor, but you were paid really little, right?
That's right, but I didn't have the degree. My colleagues at the university had PhDs, but I didn't.
But still, no matter what, you were there as a Peace Corps volunteer, so that you were paid by the Peace Corps program, which wasn't really much, right?
Right.
Remember how much?
No.
No.
I don't remember how much. We knew that it was a stipend. It was for living, and I just accepted that. It wasn't a salary.
Yeah. So tell me about your secret. How did you meet your boyfriend? What's his name, if you want to share?
I'm not going to tell his name.
Okay.
But when you turn the camera off, I might.
So we'll talk about that later.
Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was a student at the university, and
Program?
yes, and he was an English major, and so he had read so much Western literature, and was so intelligent and kind, and
He must be a lucky Korean boy at the time. And then, so you extended, and did you continue to teach at Sogam?
I did.
Yeah.
So altogether, I taught there for 5 years.
5 years. So you had to extend one more, right?
It was actually 2 more.
2 more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, altogether, after you extended, you had to do one more for another year, right?
Actually, after the first 2 years, every year was a new extension.
Every year.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was actually 3 more, yeah.
Could you tell me a little bit about the Korean society in 1969, and you came back in 1974?
I came back well, after I left Peace Corps, I got a job in Korea working for the U.S. Army, teaching GED courses,
What is
general
GED?
education courses to American service personnel. And so I stayed in Korea, and then as I was there in Korea, they let me stay in the volunteer house. And I had a visit from a priest who asked me if I would be willing to teach English to Kim Dae-jung. And I said I would. So I used to go to, after Peace Corps, I couldn't have done this if I'd still been in Peace Corps, because they wouldn't allow us to do anything that was considered political. And teaching a man who was the opposition leader at that time, who was under house arrest after being almost dumped overboard by the KCIA, and returned to his home under house arrest. I went to his house and taught him English. I think it was 3 times a week.
Wow. So, please, when did you finish your Peace Corps program in Korea?
So I finished the Peace Corps program. Let's see, I'm trying to think. Was it 74? And then I continued. Then I continued to stay for another 6 to 8 months. I can't remember how long. And then at that time, I also taught Mr. Kim. And then I left. Yeah.
I listened several times. Former President Kim Dae-jung speaking in English, interviewed by the ABC here.
Mm-hmm.
He has an accent. He's not like a native tongue at all, but he speaks very clear and very concise, and he was able to really convey what he wants to say. I was really impressed. tell me some of the experience. Was he able to speak at all in English when you first met with him?
Yes, he was. He wanted to practice his English because he was often visited by newspaper people from the West. A lot of people came to visit him, and English was an important vehicle for him to communicate with the world beyond Korea.
So he needed it.
He needed it. And I felt like sometimes he was trying out his ideas with me when we practiced English. I didn't have a regular set curriculum with him like I did with other people. I kind of arrived and we just practiced what he wanted to talk about.
How did you practice? How did he practice?
He would talk to me about things, and then I would help with correcting him if I felt that he needed to say it in a clearer manner. So I just would go there very often, like about 3 times a week, and we'd just talk about things.
What did you think of him?
Oh, he was a wonderful man. And I had, both he and his wife became family friends. And I'll tell you, later on, when he came to the United States and was in exile, he called my former husband and asked him to come to D.C., to Washington, D.C., to work with him at the Korean Institute for Human Rights.
Yep.
So we moved from Michigan to Washington, D.C., so that Doug could work for him.
Wow.
And we stayed there for a year. And at that time, I had 2 children. We had 2 children. And the Kims were very generous with the children, too. My children loved kim, seaweed.
Mm-hmm.
And kim. Yeah, my pronunciation is not so good, kim. And so Mrs. Kim would always bring containers of seaweed for my kids because they ate it like potato chips.
I also visited his house in Donggyeodong.
Oh, Donggyeodong.
He retired from the prison because the Syracuse University, where I used to teach, led an academic exchange program with North Korean MIT, so-called MIT, Kimcheok University of Technology, Kimcheok Gongokdae. For 8 years, it was the longest track 2 academic exchange program ever run, and Kim Dae-jung was fully behind it.
Yes, he was always for the sunshine policy. He really believed in the reunification of North and South Korea, and that's one of the things that got him in trouble. There were a number of things that he did that got him in trouble, but because he wanted reunification, he was branded as a communist sympathizer, and that became a problem for him.
It's not communism or communist sympathizer. It was practical approach to re-normalize the relationship between the brothers and sisters in North Korea. Obviously, there's a problem in the regime, but anyway, yeah, that's a very privilege for you to have some time with him.
It was a privilege for me, and then when I left after about 6 months of teaching him, this man that I had met, who was a former Peace Corps volunteer, who was there on a Fulbright, I asked him if he would take over to teach Kim Dae-jung, and later he and I got married. The man that I... So I always say that Kim Dae-jung and his wife, Lee Ho, were our 중매하는 분, that are matchmakers.
Matchmakers, yeah.
Yes.
Wow, what a nice to be arranged by the President Kim Dae-jung and
Yes.
his wife, Lee Ho.
Yep.
Yep. That's amazing. Now you are out of Peace Corps volunteer program, so you can talk about the politics. What was it like to be in Korea in late 1960s and 1970s? Especially, you know, Kim Dae-jung, he was house under arrest. He was the most famous but mostly oppressed dissident leader. So what was it? How did you feel about it? What was it like? What was Korea to you at the time?
Okay, the way that we were mostly impacted was by the student demonstrations. And I actually have a picture from the Sogang Herald that I will show you. It's too small to show on camera, but it's a picture of the encampment on the Sogang campus, where the military was camped there, occupying the campus. I remember one time when the police were shooting tear gas canisters into the campus. And I remember a student picking up one of the spent tear gas canisters and showing it to me, and it had the hands of the United States and Korea. It was like given by the people of the United States. And I felt so ashamed, because at the time, of course, my sympathies were with the students. All of the young women students were serving as a medical corps to take care of the young guys who were getting battered by the police. And it was a tough time. At one point, President Park Chung-hee's daughter, Park Geun-hye, who later became another president of Korea, was a student at Sogang University. Yes. And she had to be smuggled out of the campus through the back door, through our house, because we were at the back gate, and she had to be smuggled out through the back door so that she wouldn't, have problems getting out. But so it was a very tense time. I don't think I was ever as interested in politics until I got to Korea. Korean politics seemed so fascinating to me. The opposition, the protests against Park Chung-hee, all of that was so interesting to me that I became more interested in politics as a result of that.
Yeah. Yes. That's the period where the two things going on almost at the same time. Rapid industrialization, so that Korean economy took off from the ashes after the war. But at the same time, always there was a demonstration led by the university students. Mm-hmm. And so that democratization was also simultaneously going on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I remember, in terms of the changes in the economic situation, I remember going to the countryside one time with some professors from Seoul National University to see performance of Bongsan Talchum, which is mass dance, and it was performed by farmers. They were not trained performers, they were just farmers who were doing this traditional mass dance, which itself is a kind of a protest form against the Yangban and the king and so on. So it had a historical precedent. But I remember going with these professors, and we were in the countryside, and there were houses in the traditional Korean style, yeah. the rice straw covered houses, jogajip. Jogajip. Yeah. And one of the professors said to me, he said, "Look at that house. Look how beautiful it is. There won't be many of these in the future," because they were replacing all of those houses with
slate.
Tile roofs.
Yes.
Yeah, tile roofs, or in some cases, kind of a plastic kind of thing.
Slate.
Yeah.
So you're talking about new village movement,
yeah.
led by. But you've been back to Korea many times, right?
Yes.
And you were invited by the Revisit program run by Korea Foundation, and
Correct.
you know where Korean economy is, and you know where Korean democracy is. What do you think about this whole transformation?
I think Koreans are doing it better than we are right now. that democracy thing, I am so impressed. First of all, Korea is now a donor nation. One of the highlights of my return trip to Korea was to meet young people who are part of the Korean version of Peace Corps and who are going abroad to work in other countries to help people. KOICA program. And it was such a moving experience to be with those young people who are part of the KOICA. Korea is a donor nation, and it's no longer a recipient nation. So it's radical transformation. I was so honored to be sitting on the sidelines of that history and that tradition, that change. It's remarkable, just remarkable.
Had you imagined that Korea would become like this today when you left?
No.
You left in 1975.
Finally, in 1975, yes. After coming back to the U.S. for a few months in between, and then, going back.
You never, didn't you see the potential there? No?
I'm
trying to ask you.
Yes, smart, wonderful students, but that Korea would move so quickly from a poor nation to an affluent nation. When I go back to Korea now, it seems more modern, way more modern than the United States. The United States seems
more static.
More static, but also dingy. Seems dingy by comparison to Korea is so modern. That's all I can say.
I don't like that much. I already become Americanized, so I like here, but it's fast changing too much, too rapid, Yeah, that's the transformation. Whenever I ask this question to Korean War veterans and asking, compared to Korea they saw in 1950s and now, they are also invited back to Korea by the revisit program. And there's just stop somebody crying and things like that. And I felt like I'm asking that question to lead into that. And it's like a mostly intended kind of questions, but I think that's the facts, right?
Yeah. No, I just think it's marvelous what Koreans have done.
When did you actually went back to Korea? For the first time after you left?
First time after I left was after I got my PhD and was there for a conference.
PhD on what?
My PhD was in Social Foundations of Education at the University of Virginia. And I then was immediately hired by the University of Hawaii. And on a couple of occasions, I started doing some research on Korean education with a colleague, a young Korean woman who's become a dear friend of mine. And we text each other probably every other week, even now, even though she's in Fort Wayne, Indiana, as a professor. So when going back, I went back about every 10 years until the revisit, and I haven't been back recently. But when I get off the plane in Korea, I know that I can get anywhere I need to go. I don't have to worry because I can still speak a little bit of Korean, enough Korean to get me where I need to go.
Let's talk a little bit the goals of Peace Corps volunteer program.
Yeah, well, we need to we're invited to countries to provide some expertise. That's part of why we're there.
Has to be requested by the recipient country, right?
Countries, yes.
So we didn't force any country to receive it.
Exactly, exactly. We have to be invited, and we can be disinvited.
Oh.
And that's part of the reason that they said you should never not get involved in politics, because you can be disinvited, and Peace Corps altogether can be disinvited.
Any other big?
Well, part of our mission, I think, is understanding, cross-cultural understanding, but it's not something that you think about every day. And it's not even something that you are intentional about. It's something that happens, when you're with people who have different backgrounds. You learn about each other. And the third goal of Peace Corps is to come back to the United States and to teach people here about Korea. So that's why I'm here with you. I will have access to a wider audience of Americans who need to know more about Korea. Then I'm happy to do this.
So you think that Peace Corps volunteer program achieved the goal that they set up from the beginning, in your experience?
In my experience, I think so.
What do you think that Peace Corps volunteer program did for Korea?
I think it opened up people's minds to the rest of the world. It gave people experiences with people that they had never, that they would have never had the opportunity to meet before. So they got to see our strangeness, hear our interesting and outrageous ideas, and see the way we interacted with each other as men and women. And I think that you learn so much about culture.
I think that's very important, recognizing the difference, right, rather than forcing them to be like us. So I think that's very important. How do you compare the differences between so-called traditional missionaries? The missionaries were in Korea even late 19th centuries, and the Peace Corps volunteer program that started in middle of 1960s.
Okay, our mission was never to try about democracy or America. That was never part of our stated mission, as it was for missionaries to teach their gospel or teach the religious perspective. However, in years afterwards, and I've worried that maybe as an American, I was part of a colonization project, unbeknownst to myself. It was never something that people said, this is what you've got to do. But maybe I was doing that, and I didn't really realize it.